It's Sunday, March 30, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today is a writer and journalist who has been covering religious nationalism and the assault on American democracy for over 15 years. Her latest book is entitled Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Katherine Stewart, welcome to the Weekend Show.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
Now, you kind of got this book together before this current fall of American democracy. I suppose maybe you were focusing on the last Trump administration, and really this administration, or regime, as I think commentators are starting to call it more and more, is actually very different to 2016 and beyond, partly because it seems there are no adults in the room, as Donald Trump was stopped from doing some of the things that he would have wanted to last time. This time, there seems to be no oversight whatsoever. And as much as Americans hate to admit it, the fall of democracy has kind of already happened, if not the constitutional crisis. Would you agree with that?
I would. You know, when I put the thesis of this book, Money, Lies, and God, out there before Trump won in the 2024 election, frankly, I was pretty sure I would get criticism for overstating the case. But 2 months into the second Trump administration, and I can see that, if anything, I understated it. We're really seeing the principles of our democracy in peril in ways that we certainly haven't seen. Free speech, the integrity of the courts, and the legitimacy of the rule of law, opposition to corruption. These core democratic principles really and institutions are under attack. They're under attack.
And we obviously would normally rely on an opposition, having another party. But just because you don't have a parliamentary system in the US, nobody really kind of comes forward as a leader until another election cycle. So there is this power vacuum right now in terms of pushback. Do you think that's part of the problem, that it's actually hard for Democrats to kind of rally, not the energy necessarily? I think Democrats are still getting over Kamala Harris's loss and, trying to kind of come to terms with that. But it does certainly feel that to counter kind of the rise of fascism, you do need an individual or a leader to really kind of push the charge on that.
You absolutely do. You need a charismatic leadership. I think that this Democratic Party, in some regards, doesn't want to break the rules. They want to follow the rules, and some members seem to be operating as though under different kinds of rules that held in an earlier time. But one of our political parties has been overtaken by extremists, frankly. This movement is not remotely conservative. It's a radical movement. It is hell-bent on destroying the institutions of democracy, our international alliances, the institutions of a functioning government. It has declared war on the truth. And I think it's very hard for a lot of people to sort of wrap their heads around it and the pace with which the destruction is taking place.
And is that because people still judge the status quo as if Joe Biden is running the country? The Trump regime has brought about a realignment of allegiances with Putin as the friend and Europe as the foe. And it might seem unconscionable, but all the evidence for that is present. And I see it that any hope of things returning to the old way, to the original world order, as opposed to this new world order sometime in the near future, I just don't think that is going to materialize.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been operating as though there's some kind of magic pendulum in the sky that's going to return us to a state of normalcy anytime soon. And unfortunately, if you study history, you can see that systems fail. Autocracy tends to fail, but it can do tremendous damage for a really long time in the meantime. And so I think I think a lot of people, frankly, weren't paying attention. The leaders of this movement have been open for a very long time that they thought that democracy was a heresy and that it doesn't work. They spread disinformation to a tremendous degree. They exploited religion to get the rank and file on board. They distracted them with culture war issues. And they were actually really pretty open about what they were doing and their aims. And it's not like they were hiding. It's just that a lot of people weren't listening.
It is frustrating for those of us, especially in independent media, who have been banging the Project 2025 drum since late 2022 and really trying to kind of that this guide for change was written down. I mean, it's not unprecedented for those of us that have been paying attention, as you quite rightly say. But is there some truth to the fact that American democracy, people don't really or haven't ever really needed to identify what it actually is. So they don't really know that they're losing it because they maybe took it for granted in the first place.
This is true. And there's also been a tremendous, I would say, propaganda campaign against against government, big government, which really is the institutions of a functioning democracy. We've been hearing for years that, who was it who said, I think it was Grover Norquist, I'd like the government to be so small I could drown it in a bathtub or something like that.
Yeah.
This sort of allegations of waste and fraud. And when you survey average Americans about the level of waste and fraud, they come up with sort of fairly ludicrously exaggerated estimates. Now, of course, there's waste and fraud in government, and there's always room for improvement in government, as there is in the private sector. But I think we need to be reminded of all the bad things that happen when you have an absence, the good things that a functioning government actually can achieve, and the bad things that happen in countries where there is an absence of functioning government, or where you have a government that is really run by an autocrat for the benefit of himself and his cronies, a sort of nepotistic, cronyistic, and corrupt kind of government. So I think we're finding out what that's going to look like.
Or that does look like, because I guess this is something that we're going to have to all try and do, is that move it back to the present tense rather than the future. Because Trump ran in 2016 on the notion that he wasn't a politician and that he was the antithesis of politics, and that he didn't know any politicians. And he used to say, I've only been to Washington 7 times and I only once stayed the night, which obviously matters to him more than anybody else. But I feel that was kind of clever, wasn't it? Because what it did is it positioned him as the alternative, or as the antidote to what people didn't like about government and what nobody really likes about government. It's a kind of necessary evil, isn't it? We need roads and we need bridges and we need a functioning society. But he was not the man to do that. Yeah.
Well, listen, the movement preceded Donald Trump. And unfortunately, the anti-democratic movement will long outlast him. But he did give it rocket fuel because he behaves with the lawlessness of an autocrat. He's all about breaking the rules and shifting the goalposts so far that they're not even on the playing field anymore, and breaking norms. And so he's a sort of perfect leader for a movement that has long seen democracy as, in the words of some sort of the intellectual leaders or progenitors of this movement, has long seen democracy as a heresy. Within the sort of, what we saw with the Project 2025 is a sort of marriage between the new right and the religious right or Christian nationalist movement. And I refer to this sort of pairing as the power couple of American authoritarianism. But both the religious right, some religious right leaders and new right leaders more explicitly do not believe in democracy. Within the new right, this is the sort of, Russell Vogt from who's, was one of the architects of Project 2025. He's a sort of a new right guy. He and Kevin Roberts and the Heritage Foundation, those folks, they some of the thinkers in their movement long explicitly for a more monarchical form of government. And they say democracy is failing. We're facing an absolute apocalypse because of the rise of the woke, or which is basically a bucket into which they throw everything that they object to. And, we're sort of on the brink of absolute, failure as a country. And therefore we need to sort of have an authoritarian leader, someone who's going to break the rules and who doesn't respect the rule of law and is going to be a law unto himself, because that's what's going to sort of save America. And, some of them talk about longing for a red Caesar. The idea is that, like a sort of Caesarian dictator, right? But a red one, like a sort of conservative one. And then within the religious right, Trump has been referred to as like a King Cyrus or a King David, right? An imperfect ruler through that God chose to enact his will. But here's the thing about kings. They're not the kings of democracies. They're not kings of places that, with laws deliberated in public, on the basis of reason and compromise. They are the law unto themselves. And so that makes Trump a kind of perfect leader for both sides of this movement that has been longing for more autocratic governance for some time.
It does seem unbelievable, the whole shift, because it feels like it's happened really quickly, doesn't it? It feels like it's just been 2 months that he's been in, and by shutting everything down, basically it's described as the deconstruction of the administrative state, but it's actually more than that, because even the firing of federal workers, you think about the state being deconstructed, and you often forget, well, there's actually tens of thousands of people who've given their careers and their lives to this. Many of them are Trump voters. And there hasn't really been any focus or attention on those people who are maybe support him, but now find themselves on the wrong end of his wrath. How do you think that those people are going to respond? Because I know Republicans have been prevented from doing town halls so as to not have to deal with that kind of pushback. Do you think that there is enough momentum here that the people are going to be the ones to save us in this situation?
Well, I think as the price of goods and, consumer goods rises because of these needless tariff wars, as people lose their jobs, as they lose their Medicare and Social Security, perhaps, and other services that they need and want, as the Consumer Protection Bureau and functions have been decimated, as people see, features of government literally stop working, as public schools are degraded and destroyed. I think we do have an opportunity to say, these are the people who are doing this to you, right? And here are the people who are fighting for you, should an effective opposition movement really come together. But it really points to the fact that this is a movement that's really nihilistic. I mean, I think it's motivated more by what it wants to destroy rather than what it wants to create. And I think the prime example we can look at is DOGE, right? It's abundantly clear they're taking a sledgehammer approach, smashing the administrative state as they promised to do in ways that are going to ultimately prove very costly to ordinary Americans and to our government. So, for example, they're sabotaging the IRS's ability to collect taxes, which is probably going to diminish receipts and increase cheating, right? They're canceling contracts midstream, which essentially wastes money. They're starting these needless trade wars with some of our best, who were formerly our best friends, which, by the way, if they wanted to renegotiate certain things, you could have done that more effectively as an ally, right? Than as someone who's threatening to invade you. And that's going to it's raising the price of goods that people actually need. It's negatively impacting consumers. So it's really clear that the process is driven by these ideological motivations rather than any sort of rational or practical planning. I think Elon Musk sort of captured the basic thinking when he showed up with this chainsaw, right? He said he was going to defeat the woke mind virus in his crazy way. But, I think some of this was foretold in a number of episodes in the first Trump administration. So one episode I talk about in my book, Money, Lies, and God, relates to the leadership governing Voice of America. Trump hired a kind of new right ideologue to head the unit that handles that outlet. And according to multiple news reports, like in Washington Post, NPR, and others, he just started destroying things until it was basically too much for Trump 1. And now Trump has come back again, and he's really making good on the destruction of that organization and so much more. We're seeing the destruction of so many features of our country that have actually led to a kind of economic boon for all of us. Science research, education. It's really sad.
Well, it's things that people didn't even know that we did. I mean, USAID is a perfect example of this. I don't think people really knew about how we influence other nations through our generosity, which is only 0.63% of the federal budget, and yet has this far-reaching effect on people around the world and the building of nations and supporting the immigrants that eventually come to the US so that they come educated. I mean, it's all built into the system, isn't it?
I know. It really is. I mean, I think the destruction of America's soft power is really is a real huge mistake, because it's so important for diplomatic efforts. And of course, now Trump is abandoning our closest allies for Putin. With he's leading a country with a fairly sad economy, and he's no respect for democratic values whatsoever. It's ironic, because this is a movement that has claimed to revere the West, and yet they're abandoning the Western alliance, allies that have provided a certain amount of sort of benefits, not perfect, obviously, but a certain amount of benefits and stability in the post-war era. I think this sort of nihilism of this movement is also evident in I'll call it the moral cowardice of leaders of the Republican Party. So just this week, say, the Hegseth Signal Group. Think about it. The members of the administration are flat out denying what we can see with our own eyes, which is that they engage in an incredibly dangerous breach of security. They did so without lawfully following processes that are established to protect us and to protect our security apparatus and our military apparatus. So they lie to our faces about this, and no Republican leader, as of this writing, basically appears to be standing up for the national interest. They cave, just as they caved when Trump started backing Russia against Ukraine. This is the behavior of people who really don't care about democracy and actually have kind of contempt for it. And they think there's really nothing of value more than power.
And there's also a report recently, or it was kind of a leak actually, that suggested that part of the reason why these Republicans don't stand up to him is because they're not just frightened of being primaried and publicly humiliated, which is his kind of typical route, but now they are actually in fear of their health and their lives and their families' lives because of the retribution and the fact that he does seem to have a kind of militia, not to mention the 1,500 people he pardoned from January 6th doing his bidding. Do you think that, this kind of pressure campaign where it's like if you step out of line, you could get hurt? I mean, that's straight out of Russia's playbook. That's Alexei Navalny territory, isn't it?
It is. It is, and it's sad that it's come to this. It's very interesting because I think people are often focusing on the sort of free speech elements of the extrajudicial or the sort of extrajudicial, grabbing people off the street and sending them off to God knows where.
Kidnapping.
Kidnapping because they had a tattoo for autism awareness or something like that. You talk about, but it's really about intimidation and fear. It's telling people, if you don't stay in line, if you don't do what we want, we're going to come after you and you're going to suffer. And we're saying the same thing with attempted coercion and coercion of law firms. So also, Trump recently issued this executive order, as you know, attacking Paul Weiss and severely restricting that law firm's ability to represent its clients by preventing it from dealing with the government or entering government buildings, which would make it really, really difficult for the Paul Weiss firm to be able to have government contracts. So lawyers really understand that this is a dangerous affront to the nation's legal system. But and one law firm that was given a similar threat challenged the executive order and is doing that. And by the way, there are a lot of lawsuits in play. So that's one area where there has been substantial pushback.
And he is losing a lot of these lawsuits. I mean, that's the other thing it's important to remind people is that so many of these, like the firing of 25,000 federal workers, they had to be rehired, for example. And
yes, exactly.
and USAID, there was a kind of temporary stay on that. So he isn't having success at a federal court level. Is that the reason why Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, for example, came out this week and said, well, maybe we need to disband the federal courts?
Can you imagine? It's like, these are people who dress up in red, white, and blue and wave the American flag. And yet
he's a man of God as well.
They're trashing every democratic principle and institution that you can possibly imagine. And the other funny thing is, the religious nationalism piece of it is really interesting. I think this is one of the reasons why it's been really hard for people to see what's coming, because it involves, the way they get the rank and file on board is by exploiting religion. And, it's just, when you're talking about religion, we all want to be tolerant and accepting of one another's faiths and backgrounds, and we want to respect religious freedom and everybody's sort of sincerely held religious beliefs. But the fact is, this is a movement that has exploited religion for politics and power. They've essentially, look, there are a lot of religious leaders who are not on board with this at all. I've had conversations recently with large numbers of groups. I mean, I can just name a few because there are so many, like the Faith Table and Christians Against Christian Nationalism, the Baptist Joint Committee, Vote Common Good. There are just so many faith-based organizations and leaders who object to the exploitation of religion in this way.
Well, one said it to his face, didn't she? She
yes.
actually spoke up during a sermon, and that was.
If she can do it, if she can stand up
yeah.
and speak out, I think some of those Republican politicians can do it too.
Because the separation of church and state, which is supposedly baked into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and I mean, they don't care for that, do they? And you could argue that the church and the state have now fused. Is that in name only, or is that is there actually some kind of religious foundation to that?
For the fusion of church and state, absolutely. I mean, religious foundation, it's definitely not in our Constitution. Our founders really understood that true religious freedom happens when you can worship any sacred God or any sacred idea or God or none if you don't want to. And you have the right to support religion with your money, but you're not forced to with your tax dollars if you don't want to. They understood the value, the intrinsic value that comes from the idea that you can observe any religion and still participate in public life and politics without having to conform to a certain kind of religion. But this is a movement that has long used religion as a wedge, a way to divide people, the insiders versus the outsiders, the pure versus the impure, right? And it really explains the largest part of the movement's popular support. So, I mean, it becomes in a way like a justification for a lot of people's vote, because movement leaders, I divide the leadership in Money, Lies, and God into different sectors. And there's a sector of the movement leaders that are sort of very political pastors. They're drawn into networks, and they called Faith Wins, Watchmen on the Wall, and others. And they're given
like the Reawaken America
right.
group and that lot. Yeah.
Yeah. That's sort of like, there's a kind of way in which those pastor networks tie into the Reawaken America tour, which is a sort of disinformation conspiracy fest. But what they'll do is movement leaders, the sort of strategists and high level activists will gather these pastors into these events. And I've been to a number of them. You've got dozens, or in one case, I went to hundreds of pastors in a megachurch, and they're given talking points. They're given very sophisticated tools for turning out their congregations to vote for so-called biblical values, including, very sophisticated data tools, voter guides, videos to air at church. And these pastors are told it is your biblical duty to get your people to turn out to vote, their biblical values. And they're often, several of the events I went to, they were given a huge amount of disinformation. They were told that dead people are voting and the 2020 election was stolen, and, public schools are basically Maoist indoctrination factories, and we're all going to have to soon be doing these struggle sessions. I mean, this is kind of crazy stuff. And that gets these pastors engaged in, delivering this kind of messaging to their congregants.
And they reach a lot of people, don't they? Because they really are the center of these communities, especially when you look at the landmass of the US and the way that the church is often the only thing that brings people together. And my fear, though, is that this mix of politics and religion is only eventually going to leave people very disappointed, because Donald Trump is the least godly man on the planet. And so, they've given him this title of this. It's like he's the second coming. They touch him when they're praying, and he you can see him acting along. I mean, those of us that see through his performance can see he's just sitting there thinking, how long is this going to go on for? Because I want to go home and watch TV. And they are so committed that there really are biblical amounts of energy wasted on a man who cares nothing for them.
I think that sometimes it's clearer to see when it's happening in other countries. So when you have a leader like Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Erdogan in Turkey, or perhaps Orban, in some ways in Hungary, or leaders in Iran, right? When these leaders want to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, they'll bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious leaders in their own countries in order to consolidate that power. They're bubble wrapping themselves in sanctimony, right? They're saying, you can't touch me. You can't investigate me because I've got the holy men on my side. And it prohibits any investigation of the ways that they're engaging in kleptocracy or corruption, or maybe just like allowing people at the very top to sort of enrich themselves at the public expense. And it guards against any investigation of the abuses that they're perpetrating against their own people. So are those countries true theocracies? I mean, depending on where it is, we're talking degree, and there's certainly nuances specific to different countries. But I think they're often more accurately described as cronyist kleptocracies with theocratic features, of course, and suppression of free speech and suppression of political opposition.
It's very cleverly done, though, certainly here in the US, with Elon Musk claiming to be a free speech absolutist and buying Twitter for $44 billion to give, people the right to say whatever they want. Really, it was just the right to be racist again, And what's so clever about that is he actually is the last person to be a proponent of free speech when it comes to his own use of the software to kind of silence people or shout people down, because he can't take the criticism himself. And it's the same with Trump, isn't it? These people claim to want to lead the charge on free speech, but actually they don't want any pushback about what they might be doing. So it's very hypocritical. I just am waiting for people to be able to make those connections. Do you think I'm going to be waiting a long time?
Yeah, I mean, the amazing thing is this is a movement that lectured us for a long time about cancel culture and free speech. And now, have you seen the list of words that have been banned in government, in government agencies and in healthcare contracts? Things like pollution and status and
women.
Women first. Yeah. I mean, the amazing thing is like the sort of canceling, the attack on anyone who doesn't conform to their vision of a kind of like a a simpering loyalist, they'll call DEI, or, a person of color, a woman who they want to discredit. They'll call that a DEI hire. I mean, what do we say when somebody like Pete Hegseth, who certainly wouldn't have his job if he weren't a sort of Fox News person, what do we say about him when he can't even, keep his Signal chat away from where he's discussing national secrets, no matter what Tulsi Gabbard says, away from a journalist. So it's really kind of extraordinary. I mean, this is a movement that is, canceling right and left. They're trying to strong arm corporations and governments, corporations and media bosses, and law firms into doing what they want.
And full of contradiction. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? That so much of this really, goes against some of their own preaching. And so it's one rule for us and another rule for them. We need to take a break, but I want to come back and talk about the uprising that we're all hoping for. The way that, because obviously, we often talk about this subject, the fall of democracy in America, and people always write to me and say, but what can we do about it? Oh. So you are an expert, and I'm very keen to, establish that stuff next. So we'll do that in just a moment here on The Weekend Show. So it's a new year, 2025, and you're thinking, how am I going to make this year different? Am I going to build something for myself? I'm dying to be my own boss, or see if I can turn this business idea I've been kicking around into a reality. But I just don't know how to make it happen. Shopify is how you're going to make it happen, and let me tell you how. The best time to start your new business is right now, and Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. Get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates, no coding or design skills required. All you need to do is drag and drop. Their powerful social media tools let you connect all of your channels and create shoppable posts to help you sell everywhere that people scroll. Shopify makes it easy to manage your growing business. They help with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, allowing you to focus on the important stuff like growing your business. With Shopify, your first sale is closer than you think. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/weekend, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/weekend to start selling with Shopify today. That's shopify.com/weekend. We're back on The Weekend Show with Katherine Stewart. I'm Anthony Davis. Katherine, your book talks about, how religion has very much kind of been the entry point for this movement, for the way that Donald Trump was able to kind of reach these people. And I think Mike Pence was like the linchpin for that in the first administration. It was like, get Mike Pence because the evangelicals will support him.
It was Mike Pence. It was right-wing or pro-life judges, because in advance of that 2016 election, Trump actually met with 1,000 evangelical leaders in New York City for sort of how's this going to go? And he held up a list of judges and he said, all of these judges are pro-life. And so that was it. The Evangelical Advisory Council was huge. Mike Pence was huge. Absolutely.
And then, of course, Roe came, the reversal of Roe versus Wade, which was, the landmark ruling, been statute for 50 years and basically changed everything for people who kind of understand, because I think polls nationally across the US, most people are in support of a woman's right to choose. So that kind of flew in the face of that, satisfied a kind of a narrow group, a smaller group. But apparently they'd been campaigning for the reversal of Roe since Roe first happened in the first place. And so, we need to get outside of our algorithm sometimes, don't we, to kind of have empathy for the fact that there are a lot of people who seem to be very happy with Donald Trump right now, thrilled that Roe was overturned, and thrilled that he is aligning with Vladimir Putin and not so with Europe, breaking that transatlantic alliance that's been in place since the Second World War. But there will come a point, surely, and I'll give you the chance, a big question, I'm sure there'll be a big answer, but even if you're a religious person, even if you don't believe in a woman's right to choose, even if you have all of those kind of supportive connections with Trump, you still need to be able to live and buy groceries and drink clean water and not, die of the effects of climate change or by not getting a measles vaccine. I mean, living is something that everybody wants to do safely. So there's got to be a tipping point when people realize that this administration does not offer that.
I think that, well, I have so much to say. Oh my goodness. First,
all yours.
I've met a lot of people in the course of my research. I've gone to conferences and strategy gatherings, and I've been, sat at people's kitchen tables in the pews of churches. I've met a lot of people who are frankly really nice people. They love their families. They care about their communities. They truly do believe they're doing what's best for America. But unfortunately, I think when they cast their vote to defend the American family or cast their vote to end abortion, they're not necessarily arguing about, with this idea that we need to make major changes in the way our government is run. They're really making a statement about their values and themselves. But unfortunately, all those efforts have been harnessed in service of this agenda, this grotesquely anti-democratic agenda. And you sort of wonder whether the reality of what they're facing is actually going to permeate those disinformation bubbles. It's true that most Americans support a woman's right to choose and abortion rights in some form, including a majority of Republicans. And I think sometimes people don't know what's happening until it actually starts happening. I mean, we have, women dying now because they can't access the miscarriage care that they need, or they're becoming septic, or there's some kind of problem in the pregnancy and they're not able to access the fetus has no chance of surviving outside the womb, and they still have to carry it to term, which is a really horrible
and physicians are too scared to help them in some states.
In some states, women have died. I think the outlet ProPublica has done a pretty good job of tracking some of these cases. So I think, but you said something about abortion that I just have to go back to. You said that since Roe versus Wade passed, people in this movement have been trying to overturn it. That's not quite true. So when Roe versus Wade passed, most Protestant Republicans actually supported it. The Southern Baptist Convention published op-eds in 1971 and 1974 expressing support for the liberalization of abortion rights. Barry Goldwater, who was that great conservative hero, he supported abortion rights, at least early in his career. And here's a fun fact. His wife, Peggy, co-founded Planned Parenthood in Arizona.
Interesting.
When Roe versus Wade passed, Betty Ford called it a great, great decision. But movement leaders of a movement called the New Right, which felt like the Republican Party had become too liberal, people like Paul Weyrich, Phyllis Schlafly, Howard Phillips, and others, they felt like they really wanted to ignite a kind of hyper-conservative, movement to drag the Republican Party in a different direction. And they knew that they needed an issue to mobilize people, because they recognized if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. And the historian Randall Ballmer has actually documented this because he was in on some of these conversations, the professor and historian, that they sort of went down a list of issues. They thought, well, they were strategists. How could we, sort of drag the Republican Party to the right? And they looked at school prayer, but that tended to alienate some of their ultra-conservative Catholic allies. They looked at the ERA, or women's rights, but the ERA was at the time sort of going down in flames. They were really upset about that the IRS was starting to look at religiously run segregated schools. There were like these segregation academies that were often run by like Bob Jones or other sort of religious leaders. And that really upset them. But sort of like, and the IRS was looking at these racially segregated schools and saying, why are we giving these schools tax privileges? And this really upset these folks. But like, stop the tax on segregation wasn't really going to be a very effective rallying cry, right? So when they came down to abortion, it was like an issue that touches on issues of family and gender order and things like that. And they thought, wow, that could really work. So over time, they purged pro-choice voices from the Republican Party. And Phyllis Schlafly, if you're really interested in the topic, she wrote a fantastic book about this called How the Republican Party Became Pro-Life. And it took a long time and a lot of effort. But the point is, it wasn't an anti-abortion party. It was largely, a party that accepted a range of views, but that was on balance. Most Protestant Republicans supported abortion rights in some form. So
how things change.
Yeah, how things change. I'm sorry for that little sort of digression.
No,
there.
But it's useful because I've always spoken about the marketing that goes with this brand of pro-life and how clever it is, because it really isn't pro-life at all, especially once those children leave school. I mean, or even are at school and are facing, school shootings courtesy of the lack of gun legislation. And so there is this hypocrisy about, supporting children, whether, or fetuses. And so do you think that that kind of marketing exercise, branding anti-abortion as pro-life, has actually been the key to a lot of this?
Yes, because the movement, I would say the Christian nationalist movement in particular has been really clever about their marketing, about strategy. I mean, look at their legal strategy. They bring, they invest money in the right-wing legal sphere, organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom and Liberty Council and First Liberty and these other Pacific Justice Institutes. They very carefully select the right plaintiffs to mount the right cases to bring to the right court, to the right circuits, right? Creating these sort of novel legal building blocks that will lead up to a big win. And that's going to erode the separation of church and state. So they're patient, they're long-term in their thinking, they're very sensitive to public opinion. When you're speaking about the anti-abortion movement, I try go every year or so to March for Life and the National Pro-Life Summit in Washington, D.C. Every year they have a different theme, right? And they're very responsive to what's happening in the culture. So one year it's, pro-life is pro-science. Another year it's love them both, meaning love the fetus and the child, or the zygote and the child, because really they want to end, access to forms of birth control
and this kind of heartbeat bill as well, again, using language that is so, explicit to connect with people. And even as far as I remember, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but actually being involved in the development of technology that enables them to find electrical activity in the fetus and claim it's a heartbeat when it's not yet a heartbeat.
Yes, they're very good at sort of like bringing all the tools to the fight. But, people who think that, it's all gone to the States and, that's just how it is, are really deluding themselves. They're going, even these sort of morning after pills, which actually prevent implantation, which is when the medical establishment agrees that that's when pregnancy begins. And, you take a morning after pill, you're not going to get pregnant, right? But they call that chemical abortion.
Yes. Yeah.
So they find ways to reframe this stuff in order to get sympathy with the general public.
And it does seem, because, so much water has passed under the bridge since the Roe reversal decision. We've literally been hit with a scandal every day that Donald Trump is in the White House, both the last time around, everything from Sharpie Gate to goodness knows what. And it was infuriating and depressing. This time around, it seems like the daily scandals are far greater. You mentioned national security this week, which of course has, devastated America's standing on the world stage, because, our allies are not going to want to share intelligence with us anymore because they know that we are not to be trusted. So there's that. But there's also this, what I want to get to is this uprising that we're all keeping our fingers crossed for, that the people, including many Republicans and Trump voters, recognize that the country is greater than the leadership, and the country that they remember that has kept them safe, because there has not been a mainland war in the United States outside of 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. People here have been very safe, and they have maybe taken their freedom and their security and their democracy for granted, is that they may begin to see that maybe they did like it as it was, and that is not how it's going to be. So what are the chances of people overlooking their views on abortion and actually joining forces with those? I mean, apparently there was 90 million people that didn't vote for Donald Trump or didn't have their vote counted. That's a lot more people, if you add it to the Democratic votes, than who did vote for Donald Trump.
That's true. I mean, when you look at the percentages by which Trump won and other presidents win their elections, he won by a very small margin. It's not that the country went MAGA. There was a depressed enthusiasm for vote on the Democratic side, and we don't have to get into the reasons for that. But, there's so much people can do every day. I mean, the first is it's really important to get out of bed. This is no time to sort of hide under the covers and just, stream Netflix. It's really the time for moral courage. And there's stuff that we can all do. Number one, local activism really matters. Get involved and figure out what's happening in your local school board or your town hall or town meetings and local governance, because that's really critical. That's something that the anti-democratic movement has done with groups like the sort of supposed parents' rights activists, like Parents Defending Ed and Moms for Liberty. And of course, we want public school materials to be age appropriate and things like that. But the sort of lies that they spread about how, you're going to send your kid to a public school at 8 a.m, they're going to come back at 2, a different gender. I mean, this is just fantasy land. It's just not happening. So it's really important to get involved locally and sort of hold people to account and push back on those kinds of lies. Second of all, there is no substitute for getting out the vote. I mean, in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote, you don't need a majority to win elections. All you need is a disproportionately motivated minority. And in advance of the 2024 election, can't remember the name of the program, but the movement leaders said they were going to focus on 19 districts in 7 swing states. And often what they did is they focused on the conservative churches in those 19 districts in those 7 swing states. Because if you can get a church community or a number of church communities to turn out 90%, 95% of their people to vote for the candidates that the movement favors, then you can really dominate in election cycles.
Well, because you're manipulating the Electoral College. I mean, that really is the problem, isn't it? If we had the popular vote, then it probably would have been a different story. But it's voter suppression, and it's disinformation, and it's Elon Musk's $280 million, and Russia and China and Iran and all these kind of foreign actors as well, that Trump had to win in 2024. There was so much riding on it. And not to mention his own legal position, the prosecutions, the indictments, and the chance that he was going to quite seriously go to prison. So for those of us that didn't see it coming, and I miscalled the election, and I can only apologize again for the way I covered that. I really did feel a groundswell of support for Kamala Harris and this anti-Trump movement, but it seems that the Republicans are just much better organized.
They're better. They're really, really well organized. They sort of exploit faith in a way that, listen, there are things that those of us who support democracy would never want to do. We would never want to inspire or organize political violence. We would never want to spread disinformation and lies. But we should take note of the fact that they really went after their base, turned out their base, used the tools of democracy, of course, to destroy democracy. But those tools are available to us. We're not powerless. I think that they went after low propensity voters. That's really important. It's really important to speak to people who are on the fence and think their vote doesn't matter, or has some kind of little issue with something a candidate may have said in 1996 or some policy that they, endorse that you don't like. Listen, we really need a big tent. If we can agree on more, we're not going to agree on everything. in a country as big and diverse and as ours, we're not going to agree on everything, and we probably shouldn't agree on everything. No one's going to get everything that they want. But if we can agree on some core democratic principles, if we can agree on more than we disagree about, and have a kind of willingness to compromise for the sake of coalition, then I think we really, democracy does stand a chance. There are more people who would prefer to live in a democracy than a kind of cronyistic kleptocracy where, people, ordinary people are getting fleeced so that a guy like Elon Musk can get his privileged government contracts and tax breaks. I mean, it really just comes down to that. So I do think that there is an opportunity to, communicate to people what's at stake.
Well, the corruption was quite stealth-like previously, wasn't it? Whereas now the corruption is very much out front. And I suppose maybe that's the differential that people need to see, because it's so hard to actually to define democracy. It requires everybody to play by the rules and to want it to work. And when you've got half the people or half the voters not caring about whether it works or not, that's when it falls apart. So I think maybe things needed to get so much worse in order for them to get better. Maybe it just was never bad enough in his first term, and that by destroying all of these institutions and by seeing the corruption of the Department of Justice, for example, and as well as the theft of wealth, the way he talks about these gold visas at $5 million a piece and seems to think that somehow he's going to sell 1 million of them. Hasn't done his math. I mean, he has no idea. And then with the tariffs as well, car companies claiming, including Tesla, that they just simply cannot sell cars that are 25% more expensive. And so there will come a tipping point when people see what the loss of democracy actually looks like.
Let's hope. What is that lyric? You don't know
what you got till you lose it.
Gone,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The just finally, he signed an executive order which didn't really get as much coverage as I would have liked because of the signal leak this week. But it was effectively a version of the SAVE Act, which is designed to prevent people from registering to vote unless they have all the paraphernalia from passports to birth certificates.
Oh, this is awful. I mean,
it's massive, isn't it? I mean, this should have been the biggest story of the year.
Most married women change their names when we marry. And so our birth name in our, birth certificate is not the same as the name that we're using now. And millions and millions of American women do not have passports or the documentation. And they specifically said that a marriage contract or a marriage license is not sufficient.
Right.
So if they're basically trying to steal the votes away from married women who don't happen to have passports. And this should be like a massive scandal, Yeah,
but it kind of got lost in the news cycle. It's illegal what he's trying to do because, there needs to be an act of Congress to change any voting laws. But none of that really seems to matter with this regime, does it? It's just like we'll make an announcement, and by changing public opinion, it will prevent people from going to the polling place because they don't have the paperwork, and the cost of getting passports is expensive. And consequently, they reckon that 30 million people could be disenfranchised from voting, and this could keep Republicans in power forever after. I mean, this again was baked into Project 2025. This is not an accident. This is by design. Are we going to see a midterm, is my question, let alone a general election in 2028?
Well, I left my crystal ball in the other room. I'm so terribly sorry. So I can't make predictions about the future. I mean, a lot can happen between now and then. And I'm sure that, these kinds of illegal actions will be challenged in court. But, it's consistent for a movement where more and more voices are starting to talk about how women shouldn't, frankly, either have the right to vote. I think it was, this Doug Wilson, a pastor that Pete Hegseth has praised. And Pete Hegseth attended a church that was affiliated with Doug Wilson's movement. He's a sort of very political, very powerful pastor. He said it was a mistake for women to be given the right to vote. Women weren't given the right.
Or even fight in the military. I mean, he has lots of views about this.
I know. And then even voices, that advocate for, they call it household voting. The idea is that the head of the household, which is obviously a man, right?
In the master bedroom, yes.
Right. Gets to vote for, tell his wife how she's supposed to vote. And then, of course, this is a movement that seems preoccupied with masculinity. But I've got to say, a lot of autocracies have this sort of preoccupation with masculinity and militarism. Yes. And they denigrate what they consider the feminine virtues of empathy, compromise, care for others. And
intelligence as well. Throw that one in.
And they see it as a way to sort of consolidate, dictatorial power.
Yeah.
So
it's no coincidence that all these dictators are men, and I think that really is where Trump sees himself, isn't it? I mean, he wants to be on Mount Rushmore. He wants to be on a $250 bill. He wants to have the adoration of not necessarily the citizens of America, but of the dictators of the world. He wants, it's almost like Putin is his father who never loved him. He wants to get that attention, right? It's the inner child is crying out, please. And when Putin kept him waiting an hour, I can't imagine if that was probably the worst hour of his life, waiting for this phone call from this person he looks up to so much. And people often talk about what does Putin have over Trump? And Putin doesn't really need to have that much over Trump, does he?
No, and it's interesting because there's a sector of this movement that actually started bonding and making common cause with some Russian, I would say, illiberal advocates some number of years ago. They people like Paul Weyrich, who is the leader of the New Right, started making visits to Russia in previous decades and finding common cause with folks over there who are opposed to liberalism, opposed to women's rights and the like. And then, that sort of these alliances grew as people like Brian Brown and others have sort of also found common cause, Alan Carlson and some others. And they got together and they sort of formed an organization called the International Organization of the Family. I think that's what it's called. They have a conference every few years called the the Congress of World Family Congress or something like that. I actually went to it and I write about that in Money, Lies, and God. And it was really interesting because here you are with these sort of Russian and American activists and activists from other parts of the world talking about how, liberalism is terrible and make liberals fear you. And they're working with other reactionary activists in Spain and elsewhere. And then, who should stand up and speak but John Eastman, or a co-conspirator too?
The man in the hat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And he gave a kind of speech that wasn't particularly remarkable, but it's interesting that he was there. So it's a kind
he thinks of himself as a constitutional lawyer, doesn't he? And yet he seemed to be the first person to overturn the Constitution, supporting Trump in overturning the election. So we've got these religious groups and these libertarian groups also, but there's a new group that are not that new, but really they're only starting to kind of cross over into the public domain, and that is the tech oligarchs and those people who. The Peter Thiels, the people who believe that countries shouldn't be separated by borders, but they should be, regions that are controlled with technology and by technologists, and that, the kind of corporate entities could do a better job of running these nations. Can you talk to that for a moment? Because I think that really is kind of the zeitgeist right now. We're seeing it with Elon Musk in the administration. It's as if he is the president and Trump is just this empty vessel that wants to rename the Gulf of Mexico, and he's happy with that kind of stuff. But actually, it's the broligarchs are the ones that are calling the shots.
It's really interesting. I think those fantasies would make for a really interesting board game. right?
Yes.
Or maybe a science fiction novel. But, again, this is a movement like when they talk about what they really want, it's this crazy fantasy. Some of them are talking about seasteading or actually putting nation states in the ocean built on these platforms. Well, what do you do when the pirates come? Who's going to defend you? I mean, it's just, or the big wave comes and just wipes everybody out. It's
that was because there was no legal jurisdiction for them to live there, so that they could do anything, and there were no laws preventing them from doing whatever they wanted to do.
I mean, can you imagine living on a platform until the next tsunami comes? I mean, it's really crazy. But I think that a lot of those guys have this sort of, here's the thing. I think a lot of those guys, they're very rich, right? And I think people don't appreciate the extent to which people who are that rich live almost like on islands, right?
Yes.
Like walled islands where everybody is surrounding them, telling them how brilliant they are and they really believe, they drink the Kool-Aid, they think they should run the world. But they have these massive fortunes, but at the same time, they can hear from over the wall somewhere, like the cries of people who really are saying, you know what, you should be paying your taxes the same rate as a school teacher. And maybe you should treat your workers better so that they don't have to go to the government for healthcare and soup kitchens or whatever. Like, look at what some of these, workers are actually earning. It's not that great. Not the higher level, but the sort of people doing the actual like work.
Yeah.
And
regular people.
Right. Regular people. And they get the sense that, I think there's some way in which they have a sense that their wealth is unearned. They tell themselves that they earned every single penny with their bare hands. Right. And they deserve it. And so they're really open to kind of, ideologies that tell them that they deserve everything, that they should run everything. It's almost like a kind of defensive-ness, right?
Because they're not philanthropists, are they? I mean,
it's sad because in an earlier
Bill Gates aside, who does give away huge portions of his wealth.
Yeah, I mean, there's some
it's very corrupting. Clearly, it makes them crazy. I mean, that's the one thing that a lot of these people have in common, and I include Zuckerberg and even maybe Bezos now as well, is that they are all nuts. And they didn't necessarily start off that crazy. I mean, we've heard from people that used to work with Musk decades ago, and he was like, he was great. And now he has really, it's almost as if he's become possessed by great wealth and power.
I also, I wouldn't want to speculate about, the sort of habits of people, the personal habits of people in those circles. But, I do think that this sort of defensiveness has taken over for a lot of them, this sort of sense of narcissistic injury in a way.
Yes.
Like, oh gosh, I can't be criticized. No, I deserve everything. And in fact, I should be doing more. For all of his destruction, I looked it up earlier today. Musk has received something like $38 billion in subsidies, like special kinds of deals and tax breaks and things like that. So, he's cutting. Oh my gosh. I mean, this is a man whose fortune depends to some degree on science. The war on science is really shocking. I mean, we're seeing the sort of decimation of centers of expertise. We're seeing the decimation of science research. America has been such a global leader in this area. Are we really throwing all of this away? I guess we are.
Yeah. Well, people don't even realize what is being shut down, as we said earlier, because they didn't know what it was. I mean, there's 69 global programs tackling child labor and human trafficking that got shut down 2 days ago.
And now they're loosening labor laws in Florida for children.
Right.
So
right. And expanding the Muslim ban, which, to dozens more countries. I mean, this is going to completely change not just the West, but the whole world. America sneezes, the world catches a cold. And undoubtedly the tariffs are not going to work. And that seems to be Donald Trump's only mechanism for bringing in any kind of revenue to the federal budget. So, where does this end?
We'll just have to, use this opportunity to communicate to people what's at stake, what's being destroyed, and how it's going to impact them.
Okay. Well, I'm grateful to you for your expertise and for your books. And I'll link to those in the description below. But for now, Katherine Stewart, thank you very much for joining the Weekend Show.
Thank you.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News or by joining the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.